Today's topic is elevating consciousness by going beyond. I'll explain what going beyond means in the context of this talk as we progress, but the subtitle suggests some aspects of it. Lawful Power, Loving Wisdom, and Creative Action. Some of you who are deeply read in Theosophy will recognize that these are a version of the three attributes of the Logos, the great consciousness that has created and supported our universe. The phrase lawful power is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately. We all know about unlawful power. There's an awful lot of that going on everywhere, it seems like, in the world these days. What I consider to be lawful power is not power over, but power under. So power under in the form of support. So I have this little mantra I've been playing with: never power over, always power under. And I'll probably refer to that again in a little bit. So I dig around a lot in the historical journals of the Theosophical Society, and I found in the Theosophist this organization called the Order of Service for the Defense of Theosophy and the TS from 1926. Now, the historical context I won't go into very deeply, but there were some people who were not very fond of things Annie Besant was doing, and they were trying to get back to Blavatsky, and this was one of the ways that they tried to do it. But they said something that I think is very true and worthy of our consideration today. Only that insight which each of us has been able to experience as truth for ourselves and from within ourselves can be called Theosophy. Information from others can never form the basis or essence of the theosophical conception of life, but at the most ought to be considered as a help or encouragement in the search of truth. So from this, I get an idea of what Theosophy is. We know from the subtitle of The Secret Doctrine that the Secret Doctrine is considered the synthesis of science, religion, and Theosophy, and I consider that to be fundamental to the idea of what Theosophy actually is. And I also believe that we each create our own synthesis on our journey back to oneness with Source, as our belief system during a given lifetime, but also as the matrix of who we are after living from such beliefs during the present or a past life and discovering their truth or falsity. So in other words, we're constantly creating Theosophy for ourselves, lifetime after lifetime, and in the different phases of our life by this synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, which is always a work in progress. So from this, I'd like us to consider what the purpose of the Theosophical Society could be: to provide a safe container within which people can gather materials for, incubate, or self-remember, in other words, from a past life, their own syntheses of science, religion, and philosophy. So for us as teachers of Theosophy or proponents of Theosophy in our lives, we are merely guides to theosophical content, facilitators of understanding, teachers by example in thought, feeling, and action. What we say about Theosophy should always be framed as an invitation to consider our personal synthesis. So I'm going to invite you to consider my personal synthesis. It's an invitation to consider as opposed to a dogma or any kind of authoritarian pronouncement. So, what is my personal synthesis? It begins with a Sanskrit mantra from the Heart Sutra about going beyond, mentioned by Kim Dew yesterday. The Sanskrit version is Gate, Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Bodhi, Svaha. Now, what this, my own personal translation of it is: gone beyond the beyond, gone beyond even that. All hail such wisdom. So my talk today is based on this idea of Theosophy as a mode of going beyond that, going beyond the beyond, etc. And I think people will agree with me that in the vast body of theosophical literature, or even if we just stick with Madame Blavatsky, the idea of orienting ourselves towards the beyond in many different ways of thinking about it is the key to Theosophy. So that statement is a statement about enlightenment, but let's not be impatient or ambitious about going beyond. One step is always beyond the previous step. 2 steps is beyond that beyond. 3 steps is beyond even that. We can only take 1 step at a time. So I'm going to be talking about the larger beyond of Theosophy eventually, but I always want to come back to the idea that there's 1 step that we can take in the present moment that takes us beyond where we are right now. And that is, in effect, the spiritual practice for all Theosophists in my personal synthesis. So, all hail that wisdom of taking only 1 step at a time. Does anyone know how hard that is? It's astonishing to think about how much baggage we carry with us from the past and how much anxiety about the future we do, and we can't focus so strongly on the step that's right ahead of us. But I have a practice for that. We'll talk about that. Some people have apps for that. I have a practice for that. So, in my personal synthesis, what's the first step? Showing up. What's the second step? Being fully present. What's the third? Being kind to ourselves and others in thought, speech, feeling, and action. And the fourth, finding a right best next step to take in mutual joy. Now, I think people understand what showing up means. You know, we have a body, we have multiple bodies, we have an emotional body, we have a mental body, etc. Can we all show up in the same place at the same time? That's the problem, you know. We're all over the place, usually. So that's why being fully present is also really important. So we're not thinking about the past. We're not anticipating the future. I think the basis of the third object of the Theosophical Society is this idea of being kind to others, but we often forget to be kind to ourselves. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. But mostly I need to explain this idea of a right best next step. So obviously, no matter what we do, we're taking a next step. Is it a helpful or an unhelpful next step? Well, we'll find that out. That's part of our learning and growth. But it seems to me that even if we take what is called a right step, there's often a collection of right steps that we could take, any one of which would teach us the lesson or get us where we need to go. But beyond that, so here's going beyond, there may be a right best next step. And my idea is that right best next step covers all the forces in play. It really works for the greater good of all, including ourselves. And I think that it's worthwhile pointing ourselves in that direction. I think the idea of what a right best next step is will become clearer as the talk progresses, and we'll talk more about it during the workshop. So continuing with my personal synthesis, all of these things I just listed are a basic spiritual practice that allow us to go beyond the beyond on our journey back to Source, which of course is the ultimate beyond. So just to give you an example of what can happen if we apply this 4-step spiritual practice to the 3 objects of the Theosophical Society, what I want to point out is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. This is the one aspect of the Theosophical Society that every member is expected to embody in some way. For my own personal synthesis, I would reword this a little bit. I'm not suggesting that the Theosophical Society do this. This is my personal practice. To become an agent of unity consciousness without distinction of race, ethnicity, language, creed, religious or political, sex, gender, sexuality, caste, class, color, or body type, physical or non-physical. So For me, that's an example of going beyond some of the things that are stated in this object, and it's a personal practice because we are confronted with every form of diversity in every direction that we look, and it's important for us to be inwardly and outwardly responsible to that in a theosophical manner, I believe. So, how do we do this? We show up to all beings with open-minded curiosity. We try to be fully present to all beings with an awareness of their needs. We try to be kind to ourselves and all beings with compassionate understanding. And we try to find a right best next step to take together, which could be in mutual joy or it could be just in relief, which I think is the beginning of joy. So what happens if we think about going beyond the second object? This is stated as to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. Show up and be fully present for what you learn, hear, and read. Annie Besant, for example, recommends a practice. Read for 5 minutes, contemplate for 20. That's one version of it. As a way of really owning what it is that you've read. Because we rush through things. We're not fully present to what we read. And that's especially true when we're on our cell phones, scrolling. Be kind to yourself when creating your personal synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. This might sound a little odd, but people do create all kinds of stories about why things are okay or not okay. And some of them ultimately may not be kind to oneself. And so it's good to have some self-awareness, maybe a distancing factor between the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, the people in the world around us, in order to always increase the level of kindness to ourselves and to others. And then be kind to others when facilitating the creation of their own personal syntheses. So I have heard it said, I'm not going to report from where, that a typical meeting of the Theosophical Society for an hour a week is reading 2 paragraphs, or maybe only 1, from the Secret Doctrine for an hour, and then running the minute the hour is up because of the intensity of the energy in the room about people's ideas about what it means. I would say that's not being kind to others, not to mention ourselves. So I think we need to find ways to facilitate these discussions that work. And I have to say, having visited the Alcott Wheaton Lodge as they were discussing the Mahatma letters, I was very impressed with the safe container that was created here. I think it's a good model that needs to be experienced and reproduced elsewhere. And then create a safe space for developing personal syntheses in mutual respect or joy. So in other words, invite people in. Here we have some ideas to consider. If you respond to any of them, see about whether you want to bring them into your own personal synthesis of science, religion, and theosophy. Not authoritarian and not fundamental, not only Blavatsky, for example. I'm constantly promoting Annie Besant because I'm very concerned that she's going to disappear from the canon, because it seems like the only safe texts are the Mahatma letters and the Blavatsky writings. So wherever I go, when I'm allowed to, I talk about Besant. And I hate to say it, but there are some people, some places where I'm not allowed to talk about Besant. So what do we do? Joy when others hold similar beliefs and values, people that we resonate, people that we work to create friendships with that can last a lifetime. But also respect for people if we disagree with them, if we don't hold similar beliefs and values. Especially, we have to have compassionate understanding for all points of view and their likely consequences as next steps. I don't mean feeling sorry for people. I've heard there's this Southern expression, bless their hearts, which is not compassionate understanding. What I really mean here is how much suffering in the world is preventable. We look around us, we see so much of it. We're Theosophists. We think about brotherhood. Unity consciousness could prevent an enormous amount of suffering. And yet, people don't get it. They don't understand it. They won't listen. They have to have the experience of the suffering that they create as the consequences of their actions. And all we can do is have compassionate understanding for the developmental level that requires that. That's my personal synthesis. But, and here's a going beyond point, aspire to viewlessness, in other words, beyond the beyond. So, if you read some Buddhist texts, you'll see the idea wrong views. And I think to myself, would the Buddha ever use the word wrong? It doesn't make sense to me. I understand that some views are more useful or helpful than others, but I think what the Buddha may have meant by the idea that's translated as wrong views is that having views is problematic. So when I say aspire to viewlessness, what I mean is think of the relativity of all views, including your own views, and realize that if we're going to embrace all in unity consciousness, in other words, in a sense, try to take on the mind of the source that tolerates the fact that everybody is at different developmental levels, all we can do is be present with everybody's views, knowing that the whole of all of this is the evolutionary process, without clinging to our own, because if we assert them, we immediately draw the opposite view to ourselves. So viewlessness is not pretending like you don't have reactions to things. Viewlessness is really trying to fully embrace the total possibility of every way that someone can experience, think about, talk about, feel about anything that's going on in our evolutionary cycle. What about going beyond the third object, which is to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humankind? So here, the third object is one of my specialties because I've been an astral projector since I was a teenager and didn't even know what it was and was terrified of it. And it, got worse from there. Or more adventuresome, maybe is a better word. Show up for and be fully present within all adventures in consciousness, neither seeking nor avoiding them. I call any form of spiritual experience an adventure in consciousness because it's a truthful definition of what it is without slanting it in any direction of spiritual status, which is often a problem with these kinds of things. So, and another problem is seeking or avoiding. The thing is, they happen. They're human. They happen in all kinds of ways. So why not just be present for it? How many people have an extraordinary experience and are terrified to talk about it, or stop it the minute it starts up? That's not showing up. It's possible that the experience is a test for whether you're ready for it or not. And if you're not ready for it, fine. But if you are, try to embrace it, show up for it, and see where it takes you. Then you have to be kind to yourself by not labeling these experiences too quickly. So, for example, I had a being that showed up at the foot of my bed in the middle of the night, wiggling my toe to wake me up. Looked like this being was dressed in a spacesuit and took me out of my body and took me on a journey. And when I got back from it, I thought, was I just abducted by aliens? Well, no. It just happened that this being was trying to protect the emanations that were coming from it so that I wouldn't be scared to death. And I wasn't, which was a good thing. But the idea here is if I had labeled it as space aliens abducting me, I would have entered into a lot of fear and anxiety, and future experiences would have been problematic. Let higher powers decide the right, best next step on your journey back to Source. So I think of myself as having some kind of spiritual travel agency. I never know where they're going to send me. And if they send me off somewhere that is unexpected, I try to show up and learn as much as I can from it. But I don't seek it because it's enough for me to try to write any single adventure down. I have to wait and integrate it before I'm ready for the next one. And if I were asking for them, I'm sure I'd be just overwhelmed. And then finally, be willing to share your adventures with others. This is something that's not done enough, I think, because sharing the inner life is a way of creating community. And in the Theosophical Society, wherever I go, especially when I teach on a weekend, I try to encourage people to share the inner life, and people come back for that purpose. It's one of the critical things I think that we need constantly to consider as a part of our programming. But in order to do that, we have to learn how to avoid selfish sharing, in other words, asserting spiritual status, and we have to promote unselfish sharing. In other words, think of whatever we're saying as a contribution to human knowledge. So, I assert no spiritual status about being visited by somebody who looked like they were wearing a spacesuit. But as a contribution to human knowledge, I don't mind talking about it to all of you. Be curious and open-minded about the adventures of other people if they are willing to share them with you. And don't judge, label, explain, or dismiss these experiences. We have to resist the temptation to say, on page 344 of The Secret Doctrine, your experience is described with a 10-syllable Sanskrit word. Let them have their experience in compassionate understanding. So let's go on now to going further beyond. We've left behind an example of how you can apply this basic spiritual practice: show up, be fully present, be kind to yourself and others, and find a step to take. And how to apply it to just about anything, but that was one example. I want to go into something that I've been talking about in a number of talks and workshops. Basically, it's an idea that there are 3 psychic types or temperaments. They are based on which emanation of the logos we happen to respond to most strongly. These emanations are called rays. The rays are traditionally called will and power, love and wisdom, creation and activity. They have these attributes: omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience, and they're often linked to these principles: spirit or Atman, heart or buddhi, and mind or manas. And this is attested in multiple theosophical texts, from the Secret Doctrine to Annie Besant's works, The Ancient Wisdom, Esoteric Christianity, and A Study in Consciousness. Now, I mention this so that everyone will understand that what I am presenting next is a personal synthesis of these teachings from these sources and others, but they have a very strong basis in this chart that I've created. So going along with the idea of 3 types, I consider that each of us has an individual path towards source. Those who are on the will-power ray of the logos, I call mystics. Those who are on the love-wisdom path, I call empaths. And those who are on the creation activity path, I call seer. You can go much deeper with all of this in some of the YouTube videos that are up on the Theosophical Society in America web channel. So on this path, the mystic seeks transcendence of all limitations, the empath seeks unity with all beings, and the seer seeks discovery of all the levels of being and an understanding of the function of all beings within those levels. I consider myself a seer. I think many astral projectors are also seers. We're fascinated by the development of the bodies, by the chakra system, and the relation of that to the development of our subtle bodies, and then the realms that open up to us as we explore out-of-body and astral projection experiences. As what the other types are will become clearer as the talk progresses. So each type not just seeks something, they also master something. Those on the mystic path are working to master the powers and laws of the universe, and that usually is through transcending each power or law by perceiving it as a limitation and then trying to go beyond it. So the mystics are the ones that are really strong on this idea of going beyond the beyond. On the love, wisdom, empath, unity path, the going beyond takes the form of mastering beings and needs. In other words, identifying the needfulness of all beings and being fully responsive to that needfulness in some way. And then those on the seer path are trying to identify all the systems, all the parts, how they fit together, what their functions are, to create a map of the universe, which is also, in a sense, a map of our journey back to Source. Each one is personally striving to overcome something. So on the mystic path, it's overcoming illusion. On the empath path, it's overcoming separation. On the creation activity path, it's overcoming ignorance about the nature of reality in terms of various functions. People will understand, of course, that in some way we need to do all three of these, but there's one that we're especially drawn towards. Each one actualizes something, referring back to the previous slide. Mystics actualize spirit, empaths actualize heart, seers actualize mind. Each one achieves something or has a particular goal. Liberation from laws and powers, levels of being, permeation with beings at all levels of being, illumination about the functions of and the map of all levels and beings. Each one becomes, to put it in a word, a soul teacher, a soul healer, or a soul guide. And I think these are three fundamental functions of our growth. Each one of us is drawn in some way to being a teacher, a healer, or a guide, primarily, maybe with other aspects on the side. And each one ultimately embodies one of the three aspects of the Logos. The mystic embodies omnipotence, all power. The empath embodies omnipresence, which, if you think about it, is a total embrace of all beings. And the seer embraces omniscience. So I consider what I've just described here as our path back to Source. Ultimately, each ray is an element of the Logos that we try, depending on which ray we're on, to embody in ourselves, to master, and we're aiming towards developing omnipotence, omnipresence, or omniscience as a kind of ultimate spiritual goal for when we rejoin with Source. So how do we elevate consciousness by going beyond? If you're on the mystic teacher path, it's a ladder of eyes to master and transcend. This will become clearer in the following set of slides. For the empath healer, it's a ladder of beings to embrace and serve. And if it's a seer guide, it's a ladder of bodies and realms to investigate and ascend. So let's go deeper with this. I'm starting with the creative action seer path because none of the rest of what I say will make sense without an understanding of the planes and bodies as they're talked about in theosophical teaching. This arrow here will be explained later. Ultimately, this will represent physical beings and this will represent non-physical beings that the empath and healer are involved with. So, we know we have a physical plane. The upper part of the physical plane is sometimes called the etheric realm or level of being. It's not much talked about, but there's also a lower astral or emotional level and an upper astral or emotional level. Same thing with the upper mental plane, sometimes called the causal. This was talked about to some extent by Pablo yesterday. There are various names for the higher planes. I'm choosing the easiest ones to remember: Buddhic, Nirvanic, Monadic, and Divine. Supposedly, there's not much that we can know about the monadic and divine levels of being, but it's fun to speculate about them and to get some sort of systematic idea of what might be involved in our growth at those levels. So, how does this look if you happen to be a mystic or a teacher? Each of these phrases is a lesson to be learned on that level of being and a limitation to be transcended, and in a sense also a power. So for the ladder of eyes that I was talking about, at the physical level it's I survive. At the etheric level, the level of vitality or prana, it's I thrive. The lower astral emotional level, it's the pure desire of I want. At the upper astral emotional level, it's the aspiration, I hope. In the lower mental, it's I think, concrete thought, as Pablo was talking about. And then if you go on, it's at the upper mental or causal level, it's I know. This is the level where truth starts to show up. At the Buddhic level, it's I love or I embrace in unity consciousness. At the nirvanic level, it's I transform myself and I set an example for other beings to aim for transformation. And my speculation on monadic, it's I make, because these are the, as Blavatsky calls them, the dhyani chohanic powers that create and sustain the universe, the phenomenal universe that we experience. And then the divine level of being, of course, is I manifest the universe. So what does this look like if you are on the empath healer path? The I survive physical level is the mineral consciousness. The I thrive etheric level is the vegetable or plant consciousness. The I want or lower astral emotional level is the animal consciousness. I hope or upper astral emotional is the unevolved human level. The I think is the human evolved level in the lower mental. And then we have higher levels that are talked about in the ideas of initiation in theosophical teaching. The I know refers to the developing human probationers who are working on mastering the causal body. The superhuman levels of development having to do with the initiates at the Buddhic level, they're learning to love in unity consciousness. The superhuman masters are learning this element of transformation, which is why they have apparently magical or miraculous powers, and they are living and working from the nirvanic level of being. I make, as I mentioned, the dhyani chohans at the monadic level, and then the I manifest is the logoic or divine level of beings. So the empath healer is really trying to understand and embrace every one of these levels in terms of their beings, more in terms of their laws, or in terms of their location, or how they function in the system of bodies and planes. However, people on the empath path are also dealing with a number of non-physical beings. So at the lowest level, we have the ghosts and the elementals, which are related to the element of survival. At the I thrive level, it's the etheric level. They are working with what could be called gray zone souls and nature spirits. The gray zone is a thing that you'll see in some older theosophical books. Evelyn Underhill, who's famous as a writer on mysticism, one of her early books was a novel about this transitional phase between death and showing up on the astral plane. And it was for the souls that were not able to make that transition because they resisted it or they didn't have a belief in the afterlife. And she called it the gray zone and wrote what amounts to a very depressing novel of someone being stuck on that level of being, which is also very educational because, you know, it inspires you to learn something about the afterlife so you don't get stuck. That was an early book of hers. I think she learned better later about how to talk about mysticism, but it's worth looking at. And the nature spirits don't have physical bodies, they have etheric bodies, so that's why I've put them there as an invisible being that the empaths and healers can have some response to. So continuing to track our movement through the afterlife, I talk about catharsis souls. It's a term I invented just to embody very briefly what happens in the purgatorial aspects or astral aspects of the lower astral plane. And this is also the realm of the desire devas or kama devas. The religious souls are said to occupy the upper levels of the astral level of being, and they create heavens for themselves. You'll see maps in some of Leadbeater's books about how they create sectarian heavens. So, they're the heavens that are for the people that say you're the only, this is the only heaven that anybody can ever go to. So, depending on the sect, there's one for each one. Eventually, they also learn better, but that's their home for a while as they move through the afterlife to reincarnation, which they don't believe in. The learning souls are waking up on the lower mental plane, and a lot of times people will talk about how there's a sort of university or school at that level. It's also the level of what I call inspiration devas, who are the ones that inspire inventions, great works of art, fiction, novels, poetry, music, etc. And then the returning souls, the ones who are preparing for reincarnation, and also the karma devas, these can be found on the causal level. And now remember, we're talking about somebody on the empath healer path learning to embrace all these levels of being. Beyond the returning souls, we don't really find anybody but for the superhuman initiates on this level as invisible beings. We find only the devas. And I had to invent a name for each level. So the collectivizing devas are the ones who create wholes and inspire unity consciousness. For example, it's said that every nation has a national deva. That would be a deva from this level of being. Systematizing devas, these are ones who are trying to sort out all the energies coming down into the plan of the universe that are generated by the schematizing devas, the dhyana shohans, and then at the logoic level, all is one, so we don't need to think about all of this. So there's a huge amount of work and a huge amount of responsibility for the people who are on the empath healer path. And personally, I feel, and I think Annie Besant would agree, and many Theosophists would agree, that the safest path of spiritual development is service to all beings, as opposed to transcending, which can lead to the kind of inappropriate power I was talking about earlier. This is the path that the dark magicians will often try to take, to master the powers and laws of the universe to gain power over other people, as opposed to power, supportive power under people. So just as a very brief reminder of what all of that was a great expansion of, going beyond the beyond involves, for mystics, mastery of powers and laws, becoming a teacher, and learning to embody omnipotence. The loving wisdom empath path masters beings and needs, becomes a healer, and learns the all-embracing omnipresence. And those on the creative action path are involved with systems and parts, being a guide, and omniscience. So the creative action is the creation of a map through understanding the functions of all beings and then moving beings through the map. So for example, I sometimes have the experience when I'm traveling on the astral or the lower mental plane of helping a soul get from where they are to where they need to go next on their spiritual journey. And that, I think, is a typical guide version of creative action. So here's Annie Besant on elevating consciousness by going beyond. People will recognize this quote. I use it in all my talks. I sometimes call it the mind of the master. I consider, as a part of my personal synthesis, I consider these statements to be my guide to everything about my personal ethics and a key to a lot of the ethics that are present in theosophical writings throughout everybody's writings, Blavatsky, Besant, Leadbeater, and beyond, Alice Bailey, and so on. The consciousness of the masters stretches itself out in any direction in which they send it, assimilates itself with any point to which they direct it, knows anything which they will to know, and all this in order that they may help perfectly, that there may be nothing that they cannot feel, nothing that they cannot foster, nothing that they cannot strengthen, nothing that they cannot aid in its evolution. To them, the whole world is one vast evolving whole, and their place in it is that of helpers of evolution. They are able to identify themselves with any step, and at that step, to give the aid that is needed. Man in His Bodies, 1896. Now, keep in mind that if you're on any of the three paths that I spoke about, in a sense, your version of this mind of the master will be to be a teacher, to be a healer, to be a guide. The teachers specialize in teaching the difference between reality and illusion. So that's something to keep in mind. The whole purpose of transcending the laws and limitations of each level of being is to understand that at that level of being, it's experienced as reality. If you transcend it, you realize it's an illusion. And this is one of the paths back to source. How we get there? A simple 4-step process. Show up, be fully present, be kind to ourselves and others in thought, speech, feeling, and action. Find a right best next step to take in mutual joy. So if you haven't memorized all those charts just by seeing them one time, just remember this part. Mantra of the Heart Sutra. If anyone would like to join me in saying this in Sanskrit and English, you're welcome to. Gate, gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhi svaha. Gone, gone beyond the beyond, gone beyond even that. All hail such wisdom. Should we add go team? So that's the end of my talk. This is a beautiful painting. Many of you probably know it. The Path from 1895 by Theosophist Reginald Miquel. I believe that there are elements of this illustration that correspond to just about everything I've talked about. So thank you for your attention.